Section 21 of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 21. General Halleck in command. Commanding the district of Cairo. Movement on Fort Henry. Capture of Fort Henry. While at Cairo, I had frequent opportunities of meeting the rebel officers of the Columbus garrison. They seemed to be very fond of coming up on steamers under flags of truce. On 2 or 3 occasions I went down in like manner. When one of their boats was seen coming up, carrying a white flag, a gun would be fired from the lower battery at Fort Holt, throwing a shot across the bow as a signal to come no farther. I would then take a steamer, and with my staff and occasionally a few other officers, go down to receive the party. There were several officers among them whom I had known before, both at West Point and in Mexico. Seeing these officers, who had been educated for the profession of arms, both at school and in actual war, which is a far more efficient training, impressed me with the great advantage the South possessed over the North at the beginning of the rebellion. They had from 30 to 40% of the educated soldiers of the nation. They had no standing army, and consequently these trained soldiers had to find employment with the troops from their own states. In this way, what there was of military education and training was distributed throughout their whole army. The whole loaf was leavened. The North had a great number of educated and trained soldiers, but the bulk of them were still in the army and were retained, generally with their old commands and rank, until the war had lasted many months. In the Army of the Potomac there was what was known as the regular brigade, in which, from the commanding officer down to the youngest second lieutenant, every one was educated to his profession. So, too, with many of the batteries, all the officers, generally 4 in number to each, were men educated for their profession. Some of these went into battle at the beginning under division commanders who were entirely without military training. This state of affairs gave me an idea which I expressed while at Cairo, that the government ought to disband the regular army, with the exception of the staff corps, and notify the disbanded officers that they would receive no compensation while the war lasted, except as volunteers. The register should be kept up, but the names of all officers who were not in the volunteer service at the close should be stricken from it. On the 9th of November, 2 days after the Battle of Belmont, Major General H. W. Halleck superseded General Fremont in command of the Department of the Missouri. The limits of his command took in Arkansas and West Kentucky east to the Cumberland River. From the Battle of Belmont until early in February, 1862, the troops under my command did little except prepare for the long struggle which proved to be before them. The enemy at this time occupied a line running from the Mississippi River at Columbus to Bowling Green and Mill Springs, Kentucky. Each of these positions was strongly fortified, as were also points on the Tennessee and Cumberland River near the Tennessee state line. The works on the Tennessee were called Fort Hyman and Fort Henry, and that on the Cumberland was Fort Donelson. At these points the two rivers approached within 11 miles of each other. The lines of rifle pits at each place extended back from the water at least 2 miles, so that the garrisons were in reality only 7 miles apart. These positions were of immense importance to the enemy, and of course correspondingly important for us to possess ourselves of. With Fort Henry in our hands, we had a navigable stream open to us up to Muscle Shoals in Alabama. The Memphis and Charleston Railroad strikes the Tennessee at Eastport, Mississippi, and follows close to the banks of the river up to the shoals. This road, of vast importance to the enemy, would cease to be of use to them for through traffic the moment Fort Henry became ours. Fort Donelson was the gate to Nashville, a place of great military and political importance, and to a rich country extending far east in Kentucky. These 2 points in our possession, the enemy would necessarily be thrown back to the Memphis and Charleston road, or to the boundary of the Cotton States, and, as before stated, that road would be lost to them for through communication. The designation of my command had been changed after Halleck's arrival from the District of Southeast Missouri to the District of Cairo, and the small district commanded by General C. F. Smith, embracing the mouths of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, had been added to my jurisdiction. Early in January, 1862, I was directed by General McClellan, through my department commander, to make a reconnoissance in favor of Brigadier General Don Carlos Buell, who commanded the Department of the Ohio, with headquarters at Louisville, and who was confronting General S. B. Buckner with a larger Confederate force at Bowling Green. It was supposed that Buell was about to make some move against the enemy, and my demonstration was intended to prevent the sending of troops from Columbus, Fort Henry, or Donaldson to Buckner. I at once ordered General Smith to send a force up the west bank of the Tennessee to threaten Forts Hyman and Henry. McClernand, at the same time, with a force of 6,000 men, was sent out into West Kentucky, threatening Columbus with one column and the Tennessee River with another. I went with McClernand's command. The weather was very bad. Snow and rain fell. The roads, never good in that section, were intolerable. We were out more than a week, splashing through the mud, snow and rain, the men suffering very much. The object of the expedition was accomplished. The enemy did not send reinforcements to Bowling Green, and General George H. Thomas fought and won the Battle of Mill Springs before we returned. As a result of this expedition, General Smith reported that he thought it practicable to capture Fort Hyman. This fort stood on high ground, completely commanding Fort Henry on the opposite side of the river, and its possession by us with the aid of our gunboats would insure the capture of Fort Henry. This report of Smith's confirmed views I had previously held, that the true line of operations for us was up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. With us there, the enemy would be compelled to fall back on the east and west, entirely out of the State of Kentucky. On the 6th of January, before receiving orders for this expedition, I had asked permission of the general commanding the department to go to see him at St. Louis. My object was to lay this plan of campaign before him. Now that my views had been confirmed by so able a general as Smith, I renewed my request to go to St. Louis on what I deemed important military business. The leave was granted, but not graciously. I had known General Halleck but very slightly in the old army, not having met him either at West Point or during the Mexican War. I was received with so little cordiality that I perhaps stated the object of my visit with less clearness than I might have done, and I had not uttered many sentences before I was cut short as if my plan was preposterous. I returned to Cairo very much crestfallen. Flag officer Foote commanded the little fleet of gunboats then in the neighborhood of Cairo, and, though in another branch of the service, was subject to the command of General Halleck. He and I consulted freely upon military matters, and he agreed with me perfectly as to the feasibility of the campaign up the Tennessee. Notwithstanding the rebuff I had received from my immediate chief, I therefore, on the 28th of January, renewed the suggestion by telegraph that, if permitted, I could take and hold Fort Henry on the Tennessee. This time I was backed by Flag officer Foote, who sent a similar dispatch. On the 29th I wrote fully in support of the proposition. On the 1st of February I received full instructions from department headquarters to move upon Fort Henry. On the 2d the expedition started. In February, 1862, there were quite a good many steamers laid up at Cairo for want of employment, the Mississippi River being closed against navigation below that point. There were also many men in the town whose occupation had been following the river in various capacities from captain down to deckhand. But there were not enough of either boats or men to move at one time the 17,000 men I proposed to take with me up the Tennessee. I loaded the boats with more than half the force, however, and sent General McClernand in command. I followed with one of the later boats and found McClernand had stopped very properly 9 miles below Fort Henry. 7 gunboats under Flag officer Foote had accompanied the advance. The transports we had with us had to return to Paducah to bring up a division from there with General C. F. Smith in command. Before sending the boats back, I wanted to get the troops as near to the enemy as I could without coming within range of their guns. There was a stream emptying into the Tennessee on the east side, apparently at about long range distance below the fort. On account of the narrow watershed separating the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers at that point, the stream must be insignificant at ordinary stages, but when we were there in February it was a torrent. It would facilitate the investment of Fort Henry materially if the troops could be landed south of that stream. To test whether this could be done, I boarded the gunboat Essex and requested Captain William Porter, commanding it, to approach the fort to draw its fire. After we had gone some distance past the mouth of the stream, we drew the fire of the fort, which fell much short of us. In consequence, I had made up my mind to return and bring the troops to the upper side of the creek, when the enemy opened upon us with a rifled gun that sent shot far beyond us and beyond the stream. One shot passed very near where Captain Porter and I were standing, struck the deck near the stern, penetrated and passed through the cabin and so out into the river. We immediately turned back and the troops were debarked below the mouth of the creek. When the landing was completed, I returned with the transports to Paducah to hasten up the balance of the troops. I got back on the 5th with the advance, the remainder following as rapidly as the steamers could carry them. At 10 o'clock at night on the 5th the whole command was not yet up. Being anxious to commence operations as soon as possible before the enemy could reinforce heavily, I issued my orders for an advance at 11 A.M. on the 6th. I felt sure that all the troops would be up by that time. Fort Henry occupies a bend in the river which gave the guns in the water battery a direct fire down the stream. The camp outside the fort was entrenched with rifle pits and outworks 2 miles back on the road to Donaldson and Dover. The garrison of the fort and camp was about 2,800, with strong reinforcements from Donaldson halted some miles out. There were 17 heavy guns in the fort. The river was very high, the banks being overflowed except where the bluffs come to the water's edge. A portion of the ground on which Fort Henry stood was 2 feet deep in water. Below, the water extended into the woods several hundred yards back from the bank on the east side. On the west bank Fort Hyman stood on high ground, completely commanding Fort Henry. The distance from Fort Henry to Donaldson is but 11 miles. The 2 positions were so important to the enemy, as he saw his interest, that it was natural to suppose that reinforcements would come from every quarter from which they could be got. Prompt action on our part was imperative. The plan was for the troops and gunboats to start at the same moment. The troops were to invest the garrison, and the gunboats to attack the fort at close quarters. General Smith was to land a brigade of his division on the west bank during the night of the 5th and get it in rear of Heiman. At the hour designated the troops and gunboats started. General Smith found Fort Heiman had been evacuated before his men arrived. The gunboats soon engaged the water batteries at very close quarters, but the troops which were to invest Fort Henry were delayed for want of roads, as well as by the dense forest and the high water in what would, in dry weather, have been unimportant beds of streams. This delay made no difference in the result. On our first appearance Tilghman had sent his entire command, with the exception of about 100 men left to man the guns in the fort, to the outworks on the road to Dover and Donaldson, so as to have them out of range of the guns of our navy, and before any attack on the 6th he had ordered them to retreat on Donaldson. He stated in his subsequent report that the defense was intended solely to give his troops time to make their escape. Tilghman was captured with his staff and 90 men, as well as the armament of the fort, the ammunition and whatever stores were there. Our cavalry pursued the retreating column towards Donaldson and picked up 2 guns and a few stragglers. But the enemy had so much the start that the pursuing force did not get in sight of any except the stragglers. All the gunboats engaged were hit many times. The damage, however, beyond what could be repaired by a small expenditure of money, was slight, except to the Essex. A shell penetrated the boiler of that vessel and exploded it, killing and wounding 48 men. 19 of whom were soldiers who had been detailed to act with the navy. On several occasions during the war such details were made when the complement of men with the navy was insufficient for the duty before them. After the fall of Fort Henry, Captain Phelps, commanding the ironclad Carondelet, at my request ascended the Tennessee River and thoroughly destroyed the bridge of the Memphis and Ohio Railroad. End of Section 21. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at joclev.com. 2 of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant, Chapter 22. Investment of Fort Donelson, the naval operations, attack of the enemy, assaulting the works, surrender of the fort. I informed the department commander of our success at Fort Henry, and that on the 8th I would take Fort Donelson. But the rain continued to fall so heavily that the roads became impassable for artillery and wagon trains. Then, too, it would not have been prudent to proceed without the gunboats. At least, it would have been leaving behind a valuable part of our available force. On the 7th, the day after the fall of Fort Henry, I took my staff and the cavalry, a part of one regiment, and made a reconnoissance to within about a mile of the outer line of works at Donaldson. I had known General Pillow in Mexico, and judged that with any force, no matter how small, I could march up to within gunshot of any intrenchments he was given to hold. I said this to the officers of my staff at the time. I knew that Floyd was in command, but he was no soldier, and I judged that he would yield to Pillow's pretensions. I met, as I expected, no opposition in making the reconnoissance, and, besides learning the topography of the country on the way and around Fort Donelson, found that there were two roads available for marching, one leading to the village of Dover, the other to Donelson. Fort Donelson is 2 miles north or down the river from Dover. The fort, as it stood in 1861, embraced about 100 acres of land. On the east it fronted the Cumberland. To the north it faced Hickman's Creek, a small stream which at that time was deep and wide because of the backwater from the river. On the south was another small stream, or rather a ravine, opening into the Cumberland. This also was filled with backwater from the river. The fort stood on high ground, some of it as much as 100 feet above the Cumberland. Strong protection to the heavy guns in the water batteries had been obtained by cutting away places for them in the bluff. To the west there was a line of rifle pits, some 2 miles back from the river at the furthest point. This line ran generally along the crest of high ground, but in one place crossed a ravine which opens into the river between the village and the fort. The ground inside and outside of this entrenched line was very broken, and generally wooded. The trees outside of the rifle pits had been cut down for a considerable way out, and had been felled so that their tops lay outwards from the intrenchments. The limbs had been trimmed and pointed, and thus formed an abatis in front of the greater part of the line. Outside of this entrenched line, and extending about half the entire length of it, is a ravine running north and south and opening into Hickman Creek at a point north of the fort. The entire side of this ravine next to the works was one long abatis. General Halleck commenced his efforts in all quarters to get reinforcements to forward to me immediately on my departure from Cairo. General Hunter sent men freely from Kansas, and a large division under General Nelson from Buell's army was also dispatched. Orders went out from the War Department to consolidate fragments of companies that were being recruited in the Western States, so as to make full companies, and to consolidate companies into regiments. General Halleck did not approve or disapprove of my going to Fort Donelson. He said nothing whatever to me on the subject. He informed Buell on the 7th that I would march against Fort Donelson the next day; but on the 10th he directed me to fortify Fort Henry strongly, particularly to the land side, saying that he forwarded me intrenching tools for that purpose. I received this dispatch in front of Fort Donelson. I was very impatient to get to Fort Donelson, because I knew the importance of the place to the enemy, and supposed he would reinforce it rapidly. I felt that 15,000 men on the 8th would be more effective than 50,000 a month later. I asked Flag Officer Foote, therefore, to order his gunboats, still about Cairo, to proceed up the Cumberland River, and not to wait for those gone to Eastport and Florence. But the others got back in time, and we started on the 12th. I had moved McClernand out a few miles the night before, so as to leave the road as free as possible. Just as we were about to start, the first reinforcement reached me on transports. It was a brigade composed of 6 full regiments, commanded by Colonel Thayer of Nebraska. As the gunboats were going around to Donaldson by the Tennessee, Ohio and Cumberland rivers, I directed Thayer to turn about and go under their convoy. I started from Fort Henry with 15,000 men, including 8 batteries and part of a regiment of cavalry, and, meeting with no obstruction to detain us, the advance arrived in front of the enemy by noon. That afternoon and the next day were spent in taking up ground to make the investment as complete as possible. General Smith had been directed to leave a portion of his division behind to guard Forts Henry and Hyman. He left General Lew Wallace with 2,500 men. With the remainder of his division he occupied our left, extending to Hickman Creek. McClernand was on the right and covered the roads running south and southwest from Dover. His right extended to the backwater up the ravine opening into the Cumberland south of the village. The troops were not entrenched, but the nature of the ground was such that they were just as well protected from the fire of the enemy as if rifle pits had been thrown up. Our line was generally along the crest of ridges. The artillery was protected by being sunk in the ground. The men who were not serving the guns were perfectly covered from fire on taking position a little back from the crest. The greatest suffering was from want of shelter. It was midwinter, and during the siege we had rain and snow, thawing and freezing alternately. It would not do to allow campfires except far down the hill out of sight of the enemy, and it would not do to allow many of the troops to remain there at the same time. In the march over from Fort Henry, numbers of the men had thrown away their blankets and overcoats. There was therefore much discomfort and absolute suffering. During the 12th and 13th, and until the arrival of Wallace and Thayer on the 14th, the National forces, composed of but 15,000 men without intrenchments, confronted an entrenched army of 21,000 without conflict further than what was brought on by ourselves. Only 1 gunboat had arrived. There was a little skirmishing each day, brought on by the movement of our troops in securing commanding positions, but there was no actual fighting during this time except once, on the 13th, in front of McClernand's command. That general had undertaken to capture a battery of the enemy which was annoying his men. Without orders or authority he sent 3 regiments to make the assault. The battery was in the main line of the enemy, which was defended by his whole army present. Of course the assault was a failure, and of course the loss on our side was great for the number of men engaged. In this assault Colonel William Morrison fell badly wounded. Up to this time the surgeons with the army had no difficulty in finding room in the houses near our line for all the sick and wounded, but now hospitals were overcrowded. Owing, however, to the energy and skill of the surgeons, the suffering was not so great as it might have been. The hospital arrangements at Fort Donelson were as complete as it was possible to make them, considering the inclemency of the weather and the lack of tents in a sparsely settled country where the houses were generally of but one or two rooms. On the return of Captain Walk to Fort Henry on the 10th, I had requested him to take the vessels that had accompanied him on his expedition up the Tennessee and get possession of the Cumberland as far up towards Donaldson as possible. He started without delay, taking, however, only his own gunboat, the Carondelet, towed by the steamer Alps. Captain Walk arrived a few miles below Donaldson on the 12th, a little after noon. About the time the advance of troops reached a point within gunshot of the fort on the land side, he engaged the water batteries at long range. On the 13th I informed him of my arrival the day before, and of the establishment of most of our batteries, requesting him at the same time to attack again that day so that I might take advantage of any diversion. The attack was made, and many shots fell within the fort, creating some consternation, as we now know. The investment on the land side was made as complete as the number of troops engaged would admit of. During the night of the 13th, Flag Officer Foote arrived with the ironclads St. Louis, Louisville, and Pittsburgh, and the wooden gunboats Tyler and Conestoga, convoying Thayer's brigade. On the morning of the 14th Thayer was landed. Wallace, whom I had ordered over from Fort Henry, also arrived about the same time. Up to this time he had been commanding a brigade belonging to the division of General C. F. Smith. These troops were now restored to the division they belonged to, and General Lew Wallace was assigned to the command of a division composed of the brigade of Colonel Thayer and other reinforcements that arrived the same day. This new division was assigned to the centre, giving the two flanking divisions an opportunity to close up and form a stronger line. The plan was for the troops to hold the enemy within his lines, while the gunboats should attack the water batteries at close quarters and silence his guns if possible. Some of the gunboats were to run the batteries, get above the fort and above the village of Dover. I had ordered a reconnoissance made with the view of getting troops to the river above Dover in case they should be needed there. That position attained by the gunboats, it would have been but a question of time, and a very short time too, when the garrison would have been compelled to surrender. By 3 in the afternoon of the 14th, Flag Officer Foote was ready, and advanced upon the water batteries with his entire fleet. After coming in range of the batteries of the enemy the advance was slow, but a constant fire was delivered from every gun that could be brought to bear upon the fort. I occupied a position on shore from which I could see the advancing navy. The leading boat got within a very short distance of the water battery, not further off I think than 200 yards, and I soon saw one and then another of them dropping down the river, visibly disabled. Then the whole fleet followed and the engagement closed for the day. The gunboat which Flag Officer Foote was on, besides having been hit about 60 times, several of the shots passing through near the water line, had a shot enter the pilot house which killed the pilot, carried away the wheel, and wounded the flag officer himself. The tiller ropes of another vessel were carried away and she too dropped helplessly back. Two others had their pilot houses so injured that they scarcely formed a protection to the men at the wheel. The enemy had evidently been much demoralized by the assault, but they were jubilant when they saw the disabled vessels dropping down the river entirely out of the control of the men on board. Of course I only witnessed the falling back of our gunboats, and felt sad enough at the time over the repulse. Subsequent reports, now published, show that the enemy telegraphed a great victory to Richmond. The sun went down on the night of the 14th of February, 1862, leaving the army confronting Fort Donelson anything but comforted over the prospects. The weather had turned intensely cold. The men were without tents, and could not keep up fires where most of them had to stay, and as previously stated, many had thrown away their overcoats and blankets. Two of the strongest of our gunboats had been disabled, presumably beyond the possibility of rendering any present assistance. I retired this night, not knowing but that I would have to intrench my position and bring up tents for the men, or build huts under the cover of the hills. On the morning of the 15th, before it was yet broad day, a messenger from Flag Officer Foote handed me a note expressing a desire to see me on the flagship, and saying that he had been injured the day before so much that he could not come himself to me. I at once made my preparations for starting. I directed my adjutant general to notify each of the division commanders of my absence, and instruct them to do nothing to bring on an engagement until they received further orders, but to hold their positions. From the heavy rains that had fallen for days and weeks preceding, and from the constant use of the roads between the troops and the landing 4 to 7 miles below, these roads had become cut up so as to be hardly passable. The intense cold of the night of the 14th and 15th had frozen the ground solid. This made travel on horseback even slower than through the mud, but I went as fast as the roads would allow. When I reached the fleet, I found the flagship was anchored out in the stream. A small boat, however, awaited my arrival, and I was soon on board with the flag officer. He explained to me in short the condition in which he was left by the engagement of the evening before, and suggested that I should intrench while he returned to Mound City with his disabled boats, expressing at the time the belief that he could have the necessary repairs made and be back in 10 days. I saw the absolute necessity of his gunboats going into hospital, and did not know but I should be forced to the alternative of going through a siege. But the enemy relieved me from this necessity. When I left the National line to visit Flag Officer Foote, I had no idea that there would be any engagement on land unless I brought it on myself. The conditions for battle were much more favorable to us than they had been for the first 2 days of the investment. From the 12th to the 14th we had but 15,000 men of all arms and no gunboats. Now we had been reinforced by a fleet of 6 naval vessels, a large division of troops under General L. Wallace, and 2,500 men brought over from Fort Henry belonging to the division of C. F. Smith. The enemy, however, had taken the initiative. Just as I landed I met Captain Hillier of my staff, white with fear, not for his personal safety but for the safety of the National troops. He said the enemy had come out of his lines in full force, and attacked and scattered McClernand's division, which was in full retreat. The roads, as I have said, were unfit for making fast time, but I got to my command as soon as possible. The attack had been made on the National right. I was some 4 or 5 miles north of our left. The line was about 3 miles long. In reaching the point where the disaster had occurred I had to pass the divisions of Smith and Wallace. I saw no sign of excitement on the portion of the line held by Smith. Wallace was nearer the scene of conflict and had taken part in it. He had, at an opportune time, sent Thayer's brigade to the support of McClernand, and thereby contributed to hold the enemy within his lines. I saw everything favorable for us along the line of our left and centre. When I came to the right appearances were different. The enemy had come out in full force to cut his way out and make his escape. McClernand's division had to bear the brunt of the attack from this combined force. His men had stood up gallantly until the ammunition in their cartridge boxes gave out. There was abundance of ammunition near by, lying on the ground in boxes. But at that stage of the war it was not all of our commanders of regiments, brigades, or even divisions who had been educated up to the point of seeing that their men were constantly supplied with ammunition during an engagement. When the men found themselves without ammunition, they could not stand up against troops who seemed to have plenty of it. The division broke and a portion fled, but most of the men, as they were not pursued, only fell back out of range of the fire of the enemy. It must have been about this time that Thayer pushed his brigade in between the enemy and those of our troops that were without ammunition. At all events, the enemy fell back within his intrenchments and was there when I got on the field. I saw the men standing in knots, talking in the most excited manner. No officer seemed to be giving any directions. The soldiers had their muskets, but no ammunition, while there were tons of it close at hand. I heard some of the men say that the enemy had come out with knapsacks and haversacks filled with rations. They seemed to think this indicated a determination on his part to stay out and fight just as long as the provisions held out. I turned to Colonel J.D. Webster of my staff, who was with me, and said, "Some of our men are pretty badly demoralized, but the enemy must be more so, for he has attempted to force his way out, but has fallen back. The one who attacks first now will be victorious, and the enemy will have to be in a hurry if he gets ahead of me." I determined to make the assault at once on our left. It was clear to my mind that the enemy had started to march out with his entire force, except a few pickets, and if our attack could be made on the left before the enemy could redistribute his forces along the line, we would find but little opposition except from the intervening abatis. I directed Colonel Webster to ride with me and call out to the men as we passed, "Fill your cartridge boxes quick and get into line. The enemy is trying to escape and he must not be permitted to do so." This acted like a charm. The men only wanted some one to give them a command. We rode rapidly to Smith's quarters, when I explained the situation to him and directed him to charge the enemy's works in his front with his whole division, saying at the same time that he would find nothing but a very thin line to contend with. The general was off in an incredibly short time, going in advance himself to keep his men from firing while they were working their way through the abatis intervening between them and the enemy. The outer line of rifle pits was passed, and the night of the 15th General Smith, with much of his division, bivouacked within the lines of the enemy. There was now no doubt but that the Confederates must surrender or be captured the next day. There seems, from subsequent accounts, to have been much consternation, particularly among the officers of high rank, in Dover during the night of the 15th. General Floyd, the commanding officer, who was a man of talent enough for any civil position, was no soldier and, possibly, did not possess the elements of one. He was further unfitted for command for the reason that his conscience must have troubled him and made him afraid. As Secretary of War he had taken a solemn oath to maintain the Constitution of the United States and to uphold the same against all its enemies. He had betrayed that trust. As Secretary of War he was reported through the Northern press to have scattered the little army the country had so that the most of it could be picked up in detail when secession occurred. About a year before leaving the cabinet he had removed arms from Northern to Southern arsenals. He continued in the cabinet of President Buchanan until about the 1st of January, 1861, while he was working vigilantly for the establishment of a Confederacy made out of United States territory. Well may he have been afraid to fall into the hands of national troops. He would, no doubt, have been tried for misappropriating public property, if not for treason, had he been captured. General Pillow, next in command, was conceited and prided himself much on his services in the Mexican War. He telegraphed to General Johnston at Nashville, after our men were within the rebel rifle pits and almost on the eve of his making his escape, that the Southern troops had had great success all day. Johnson forwarded the dispatch to Richmond. While the authorities at the capital were reading it, Floyd and Pillow were fugitives. A council of war was held by the enemy at which all agreed that it would be impossible to hold out longer. General Buckner, who was third in rank in the garrison but much the most capable soldier, seems to have regarded it a duty to hold the fort until the general commanding the department, A.S. Johnston, should get back to his headquarters at Nashville. Buckner's report shows, however, that he considered Donaldson lost, and that any attempt to hold the place longer would be at the sacrifice of the command. Being assured that Johnston was already in Nashville, Buckner too agreed that surrender was the proper thing. Floyd turned over the command to Pillow, who declined it. It then devolved upon Buckner, who accepted the responsibility of the position. Floyd and Pillow took possession of all the river transports at Dover, and before morning both were on their way to Nashville with the brigade formerly commanded by Floyd and some other troops, in all about 3,000. Some marched up the east bank of the Cumberland, others went on the steamers. During the night, Forrest also, with his cavalry and some other troops, about 1,000 in all, made their way out, passing between our right and the river. They had to ford or swim over the backwater in the little creek just south of Dover. Before daylight General Smith brought to me the following letter from General Buckner: Headquarters, Fort Donelson, February 16, 1862. Sir: in consideration of all the circumstances governing the present situation of affairs at this station, I propose to the commanding officer of the Federal forces the appointment of commissioners to agree upon terms of capitulation of the forces and fort under my command, and in that view suggest an armistice until 12 o'clock to-day. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, S.B. Buckner, Brigadier General, C.S.A. To Brigadier General U.S. Grant, commanding U.S. forces near Fort Donelson. To this I responded as follows: Headquarters, Army in the Field, Camp near Donelson, February 16, 1862. General S.B. Buckner, Confederate Army. Sir: yours of this date, proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation, is just received. No terms, except an unconditional an immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General. To this I received the following reply: HEADQUARTERS, Dover, Tennessee, February 16, 1862. To Brigadier General U.S. Grant, U.S. Army. Sir: the distribution of the forces under my command, incident to an unexpected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your command compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which you propose. I am, sir, your very obedient servant, S. B. Buckner, Brigadier General, C.S.A. General Buckner, as soon as he had dispatched the first of the above letters, sent word to his different commanders on the line of rifle pits, notifying them that he had made a proposition looking to the surrender of the garrison, and directing them to notify National troops in their front, so that all fighting might be prevented. White flags were stuck at intervals along the line of rifle pits, but none over the fort. As soon as the last letter from Buckner was received, I mounted my horse and rode to Dover. General Wallace, I found, had preceded me an hour or more. I presume that, seeing white flags exposed in his front, he rode up to see what they meant, and, not being fired upon or halted, he kept on until he found himself at the headquarters of General Buckner. I had been at West Point 3 years with Buckner, and afterwards served with him in the army, so that we were quite well acquainted. In the course of our conversation, which was very friendly, he said to me that if he had been in command I would not have got up to Donaldson as easily as I did. I told him that if he had been in command I should not have tried in the way I did. I had invested their lines with a smaller force than they had to defend them, and at the same time had sent a brigade full 5,000 strong around by water. I had relied very much upon their commander to allow me to come safely up to the outside of their works. I asked General Buckner about what force he had to surrender. He replied that he could not tell with any degree of accuracy, that all the sick and weak had been sent to Nashville while we were about Fort Henry; that Floyd and Pillow had left during the night, taking many men with them; and that Forrest and probably others had also escaped during the preceding night. The number of casualties he could not tell, but he said I would not find fewer than 12,000 nor more than 15,000. He asked permission to send parties outside of the lines to bury his dead who had fallen on the 15th when they tried to get out. I gave directions that his permit to pass our limits should be recognized. I have no reason to believe that this privilege was abused, but it familiarized our guards so much with the sight of Confederates passing to and fro that I have no doubt many got beyond our pickets unobserved and went on. The most of the men who went in that way no doubt thought they had had war enough and left with the intention of remaining out of the army. Some came to me and asked permission to go, saying that they were tired of the war and would not be caught in the ranks again, and I bade them go. The actual number of Confederates at Fort Donelson can never be given with entire accuracy. The largest number admitted by any writer on the Southern side is by Colonel Preston Johnston. He gives the number at 17,000, but this must be an underestimate. The Commissary General of Prisoners reported having issued rations to 14,623 Fort Donelson prisoners at Cairo. As they passed that point, General Pillow reported the killed and wounded at 2,000, but he had less opportunity of knowing the actual numbers than the officers of McClernand's division, for most of the killed and wounded fell outside their works in front of that division, and were buried or cared for by Buckner after the surrender and when Pillow was a fugitive. It is known that Floyd and Pillow escaped during the night of the 15th, taking with them not less than 3,000 men. Forrest escaped with about 1,000, and others were leaving singly and in squads all night. It is probable that the Confederate force at Donaldson on the 15th of February, 1862, was 21,000 in round numbers. On the day Fort Donelson fell, I had 27,000 men to confront the Confederate lines and guard the road 4 or 5 miles to the left, over which all our supplies had to be drawn on wagons. During the 16th, after the surrender, additional reinforcements arrived. During the siege, General Sherman had been sent to Smithland, at the mouth of the Cumberland River, to forward reinforcements and supplies to me. At that time he was my senior in rank, and there was no authority of law to assign a junior to command a senior of the same grade. But every boat that came up with supplies or reinforcements brought a note of encouragement from Sherman, asking me to call upon him for any assistance he could render, and saying that if he could be of service at the front I might send for him and he would waive rank. End of section 22. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com. Of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 23. Promoted Major General of Volunteers. Unoccupied Territory. Advance upon Nashville. Situation of the troops. Confederate retreat. Relieved of the command. Restored to the command. General Smith. The news of the fall of Fort Donelson caused great delight all over the North. At the South, particularly in Richmond, the effect was correspondingly depressing. I was promptly promoted to the grade of Major General of Volunteers and confirmed by the Senate. All 3 of my division commanders were promoted to the same grade, and the colonels who commanded brigades were made brigadier generals in the volunteer service. My chief, who was in St. Louis, telegraphed his congratulations to General Hunter in Kansas for the services he had rendered in securing the fall of Fort Donelson by sending reinforcements so rapidly. To Washington he telegraphed that the victory was due to General C. F. Smith. "Promote him," he said, "and the whole country will applaud." On the 19th there was published at St. Louis a formal order thanking Flag officer Foote and myself and the forces under our command for the victories on the Tennessee and the Cumberland. I received no other recognition whatever from General Halleck, but General Cullom, his chief of staff, who was at Cairo, wrote me a warm congratulatory letter on his own behalf. I approved of General Smith's promotion highly, as I did all the promotions that were made. My opinion was, and still is, that immediately after the fall of Fort Donelson the way was opened to the National forces all over the Southwest without much resistance. If one general who would have taken the responsibility had been in command of all the troops west of the Alleghanies, he could have marched to Chattanooga, Corinth, Memphis, and Vicksburg with the troops we then had, and as volunteering was going on rapidly over the North, there would soon have been force enough at all these centers to operate offensively against any body of the enemy that might be found near them. Rapid movements and the acquisition of rebellious territory would have prompted volunteering, so that reinforcements could have been had as fast as transportation could have been obtained to carry them to their destination. On the other hand, there were tens of thousands of strong, able-bodied young men still at their homes in the southwestern states who had not gone into the Confederate army in February, 1862, and who had no particular desire to go. If our lines had been extended to protect their homes, many of them never would have gone. Providence ruled differently. Time was given the enemy to collect armies and fortify his new positions, and twice afterwards he came near forcing his northwestern front up to the Ohio River. I promptly informed the department commander of our success at Fort Donelson, and that the way was open now to Clarksville and Nashville, and that unless I received orders to the contrary, I should take Clarksville on the 21st and Nashville about the 1st of March. Both these places are on the Cumberland River, above Fort Donelson. As I heard nothing from headquarters on the subject, General C. F. Smith was sent to Clarksville at the time designated and found the place evacuated. The capture of Forts Henry and Donaldson had broken the line the enemy had taken from Columbus to Bowling Green, and it was known that he was falling back from the eastern point of this line and that Buell was following, or at least advancing. I should have sent troops to Nashville at the time I sent to Clarksville, but my transportation was limited and there were many prisoners to be forwarded north. None of the reinforcements from Buell's army arrived until the 24th of February. Then General Nelson came up with orders to report to me with 2 brigades, he having sent 1 brigade to Cairo. I knew General Buell was advancing on Nashville from the north, and I was advised by scouts that the rebels were leaving that place and trying to get out all the supplies they could. Nashville was at that time one of the best provisioned posts in the South. I had no use for reinforcements now, and thinking Buell would like to have his troops again, I ordered Nelson to proceed to Nashville without debarking at Fort Donelson. I sent a gunboat also as a convoy. The Cumberland River was very high at the time. The railroad bridge at Nashville had been burned, and all river craft had been destroyed or would be before the enemy left. Nashville is on the west bank of the Cumberland, and Buell was approaching from the east. I thought the steamers carrying Nelson's division would be useful in ferrying the balance of Buell's forces across. I ordered Nelson to put himself in communication with Buell as soon as possible, and if he found him more than 2 days off from Nashville, to return below the city and await orders. Buell, however, had already arrived in person at Edgefield, opposite Nashville, and Mitchell's division of his command reached there the same day. Nelson immediately took possession of the city. After Nelson had gone, and before I had learned of Buell's arrival, I sent word to department headquarters that I should go to Nashville myself on the 28th if I received no orders to the contrary. Hearing nothing, I went as I had informed my superior officer I would do. On arriving at Clarksville I saw a fleet of steamers at the shore, the same that had taken Nelson's division, and troops going aboard. I landed and called on the commanding officer, General C. F. Smith. As soon as he saw me he showed an order he had just received from Buell in these words: Nashville, February 25, 1862. General C. F. Smith, commanding U.S. Forces, Clarksville. General: the landing of a portion of our troops, contrary to my intentions, on the south side of the river has compelled me to hold this side at every hazard. If the enemy should assume the offensive, and I am assured by reliable persons that in view of my position such is his intention, my force present is altogether inadequate, consisting of only 15,000 men. I have to request you, therefore, to come forward with all the available force under your command. So important do I consider the occasion that I think it necessary to give this communication all the force of orders, and I send 4 boats, the Diana, Woodford, John Rain, and Autocrat, to bring you up. In 5 or 6 days my force will probably be sufficient to relieve you. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, D. C. Buell, Brigadier General, commanding. P.S. The steamers will leave here at 12 o'clock tonight. General Smith said this order was nonsense, but I told him it was better to obey it. The general replied, of course I must obey, and said his men were embarking as fast as they could. I went on up to Nashville and inspected the position taken by Nelson's troops. I did not see Buell during the day, and wrote him a note saying that I had been in Nashville since early morning and had hoped to meet him. On my return to the boat we met. His troops were still east of the river, and the steamers that had carried Nelson's division up were mostly at Clarksville to bring Smith's division. I said to General Buell my information was that the enemy was retreating as fast as possible. General Buell said there was fighting going on then only 10 or 12 miles away. I said, quite probably. Nashville contained valuable stores of arms, ammunition, and provisions, and the enemy is probably trying to carry away all he can. The fighting is doubtless with the rear guard, who are trying to protect the trains they are getting away with. Buell spoke very positively of the danger Nashville was in of an attack from the enemy. I said, in the absence of positive information, I believed my information was correct. He responded that he knew. Well, I said, I do not know. But as I came by Clarksville, General Smith's troops were embarking to join you. Smith's troops were returned the same day. The enemy were trying to get away from Nashville and not to return to it. At this time General Albert Sidney Johnston commanded all the Confederate troops west of the Alleghany Mountains, with the exception of those in the extreme south. On the national side, the forces confronting him were divided into, at first 3, then 4 separate departments. Johnston had greatly the advantage in having supreme command over all troops that could possibly be brought to bear upon one point, while the forces similarly situated on the national side, divided into independent commands, could not be brought into harmonious action except by orders from Washington. At the beginning of 1862, Johnston's troops, east of the Mississippi, occupied a line extending from Columbus on his left to Mill Springs on his right. As we have seen, Columbus, both banks of the Tennessee River, the west bank of the Cumberland and Bowling Green, all were strongly fortified. Mill Springs was entrenched. The National troops occupied no territory south of the Ohio except 3 small garrisons along its bank and a force thrown out from Louisville to confront that at Bowling Green. Johnston's strength was, no doubt, numerically inferior to that of the National troops, but this was compensated for by the advantage of being sole commander of all the Confederate forces at the West, and of operating in a country where his friends would take care of his rear without any detail of soldiers. But when General George H. Thomas moved upon the enemy at Mill Springs and totally routed him, inflicting a loss of some 300 killed and wounded, and Forts Henry and Hyman fell into the hands of the National forces with their armaments and about 100 prisoners, those losses seemed to dishearten the Confederate commander so much that he immediately commenced a retreat from Bowling Green on Nashville. He reached this latter place on the 14th of February while Donelson was still besieged. Buell followed with a portion of the Army of the Ohio, but he had to march and did not reach the east bank of the Cumberland opposite Nashville until the 24th of the month, and then with only 1 division of his army. The bridge at Nashville had been destroyed and all boats removed or disabled, so that a small garrison could have held the place against any National troops that could have been brought against it within 10 days after the arrival of the force from Bowling Green. Johnston seemed to lie quietly at Nashville to await the result at Fort Donelson, on which he had staked the possession of most of the territory embraced in the States of Kentucky and Tennessee. It is true, the 2 generals senior in rank at Fort Donelson were sending him encouraging dispatches, even claiming great Confederate victories up to the night of the 16th, when they must have been preparing for their individual escape. Johnston made a fatal mistake in entrusting so important a command to Floyd, who he must have known was no soldier, even if he possessed the elements of one. Pillow's presence as second was also a mistake. If these officers had been forced upon him and designated for that particular command, then he should have left Nashville with a small garrison under a trusty officer, and with the remainder of his force gone to Donaldson himself. If he had been captured, the result could not have been worse than it was. Johnston's heart failed him upon the first advance of National troops. He wrote to Richmond on the 8th of February, "I think the gunboats of the enemy will probably take Fort Donelson without the necessity of employing their land force in cooperation." After the fall of that place he abandoned Nashville and Chattanooga without an effort to save either, and fell back into northern Mississippi, where, 6 weeks later, he was destined to end his career. From the time of leaving Cairo, I was singularly unfortunate in not receiving dispatches from General Halleck. The order of the 10th of February, directing me to fortify Fort Henry strongly, particularly to the land side, and saying that intrenching tools had been sent for that purpose, reached me after Donaldson was invested. I received nothing direct which indicated that the department commander knew we were in possession of Donaldson. I was reporting regularly to the chief of staff, who had been sent to Cairo soon after the troops left there, to receive all reports from the front and to telegraph the substance to the St. Louis headquarters. Cairo was at the southern end of the telegraph wire. Another line was started at once from Cairo to Paducah and Smithland, at the mouths of the Tennessee and Cumberland respectively. My dispatches were all sent to Cairo by boat, but many of those addressed to me were sent to the operator at the end of the advancing wire, and he failed to forward them. This operator afterwards proved to be a rebel. He deserted his post after a short time and went south, taking his dispatches with him. A telegram from General McClellan to me of February 16th, the day of the surrender, directing me to report in full the situation, was not received at my headquarters until the 3d of March. On the 2d of March I received orders dated March 1st to move my command back to Fort Henry, leaving only a small garrison at Donaldson. From Fort Henry expeditions were to be sent against Eastport, Mississippi, and Paris, Tennessee. We started from Donaldson on the 4th, and the same day I was back on the Tennessee River. On March 4th I also received the following dispatch from General Halleck: Major General U.S. Grant, Fort Henry. You will place Major General C.F. Smith in command of expedition, and remain yourself at Fort Henry. Why do you not obey my orders to report strength and positions of your command? H. W. Halleck, Major General. I was surprised. This was the first intimation I had received that General Halleck had called for information as to the strength of my command. On the 6th he wrote to me again: "Your going to Nashville without authority, and when your presence with your troops was of the utmost importance, was a matter of very serious complaint at Washington, so much so that I was advised to arrest you on your return." This was the first I knew of his objecting to my going to Nashville. That place was not beyond the limits of my command, which, it had been expressly declared in orders, were not defined. Nashville is west of the Cumberland River, and I had sent troops that had reported to me for duty to occupy the place. I turned over the command as directed, and then replied to General Halleck courteously, but asked to be relieved from further duty under him. Later I learned that General Halleck had been calling lustily for more troops, promising that he would do something important if he could only be sufficiently reinforced. McClellan asked him what force he then had. Halleck telegraphed me to supply the information so far as my command was concerned, but I received none of his dispatches. At last Halleck reported to Washington that he had repeatedly ordered me to give the strength of my force, but could get nothing out of me; that I had gone to Nashville beyond the limits of my command without his authority, and that my army was more demoralized by victory than the army at Bull Run had been by defeat. General McClellan on this information ordered that I should be relieved from duty, and that an investigation should be made into any charges against me. He even authorized my arrest. Thus, in less than 2 weeks after the victory at Donelson, the two leading generals in the army were in correspondence as to what disposition should be made of me, and in less than 3 weeks I was virtually in arrest and without a command. On the 13th of March I was restored to command, and on the 17th Halleck sent me a copy of an order from the War Department which stated that accounts of my misbehavior had reached Washington, and directed him to investigate and report the facts. He forwarded also a copy of a detailed dispatch from himself to Washington entirely exonerating me, but he did not inform me that it was his own reports that had created all the trouble. On the contrary, he wrote to me: "Instead of relieving you, I wish you, as soon as your new army is in the field, to assume immediate command and lead it to new victories." In consequence I felt very grateful to him, and supposed it was his interposition that had set me right with the government. I never knew the truth until General Badeau unearthed the facts in his researches for his history of my campaigns. General Halleck unquestionably deemed General C. F. Smith a much fitter officer for the command of all the forces in the military district than I was, and to render him available for such command, desired his promotion to antedate mine and those of the other division commanders. It is probable that the general opinion was that Smith's long service in the army and distinguished deeds rendered him the more proper person for such command. Indeed, I was rather inclined to this opinion myself at that time, and would have served as faithfully under Smith as he had done under me. But this did not justify the dispatches which General Halleck sent to Washington, or his subsequent concealment of them from me when pretending to explain the action of my superiors. On receipt of the order restoring me to command, I proceeded to Savannah on the Tennessee, to which point my troops had advanced. General Smith was delighted to see me, and was unhesitating in his denunciation of the treatment I had received. He was on a sick bed at the time, from which he never came away alive. His death was a severe loss to our Western army. His personal courage was unquestioned, his judgment and professional acquirements were unsurpassed, and he had the confidence of those he commanded as well as those over him. End of Section 23. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com. Of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 24. The Army at Pittsburgh Landing. Injured by a fall. The Confederate attack at Shiloh. The first day's fight at Shiloh. General Sherman. Condition of the army. Close of the first day's fight. The second day's fight. Retreat and defeat of the Confederates. When I resumed command on the 17th of March, I found the army divided, about half being on the east bank of the Tennessee at Savannah, while one division was at Crump's Landing on the west bank about 4 miles higher up, and the remainder at Pittsburgh Landing 5 miles above Crump's. The enemy was enforced at Corinth, the junction of the two most important railroads in the Mississippi Valley, one connecting Memphis and the Mississippi River with the east, and the other leading south to all the cotton states. Still another railroad connects Corinth with Jackson in West Tennessee. If we obtained possession of Corinth, the enemy would have no railroad for the transportation of armies or supplies until that running east from Vicksburg was reached. It was the great strategic position at the west, between the Tennessee and the Mississippi rivers, and between Nashville and Vicksburg. I at once put all the troops at Savannah in motion for Pittsburgh Landing, knowing that the enemy was fortifying at Corinth and collecting an army there under Johnston. It was my expectation to march against that army as soon as Buell, who had been ordered to reinforce me with the Army of the Ohio, should arrive, and the west bank of the river was the place to start from. Pittsburgh is only about 20 miles from Corinth, and Hamburg Landing, 4 miles further up the river, is a mile or two nearer. I had not been in command long before I selected Hamburg as the place to put the Army of the Ohio when it arrived. The roads from Pittsburg and Hamburg to Corinth converge some 8 miles out. This disposition of the troops would have given additional roads to march over when the advance commenced, within supporting distance of each other. Before I arrived at Savannah, Sherman, who had joined the Army of the Tennessee and been placed in command of a division, had made an expedition on steamers convoyed by gunboats to the neighborhood of Eastport, 30 miles south, for the purpose of destroying the railroad east of Corinth. The rains had been so heavy for some time before that the lowlands had become impassable swamps. Sherman debarked his troops and started out to accomplish the object of the expedition, but the river was rising so rapidly that the backwater up to small tributaries threatened to cut off the possibility of getting back to the boats, and the expedition had to return without reaching the railroad. The guns had to be hauled by hand through the water to get back to the boats. On the 17th of March, the army on the Tennessee River consisted of 5 divisions, commanded respectively by Generals C. F. Smith, McClernand, L. Wallace, Hurlbut, and Sherman. General W. H. L. Wallace was temporarily in command of Smith's division, General Smith, as I have said, being confined to his bed. Reinforcements were arriving daily, and as they came up they were organized first into brigades, then into a division, and the command given to General Prentiss, who had been ordered to report to me. General Buell was on his way from Nashville with 40,000 veterans. On the 19th of March he was at Columbia, Tennessee, 85 miles from Pittsburg. When all reinforcements should have arrived, I expected to take the initiative by marching on Corinth, and had no expectation of needing fortifications, though the subject was taken into consideration. McPherson, my only military engineer, was directed to lay out a line to intrench. He did so, but reported that it would have to be made in rear of the line of encampment as it then ran. The new line, while it would be nearer the river, was yet too far away from the Tennessee or even from the creeks to be easily supplied with water, and in case of attack these creeks would be in the hands of the enemy. The fact is, I regarded the campaign we were engaged in as an offensive one, and had no idea that the enemy would leave strong intrenchments to take the initiative when he knew he would be attacked where he was if he remained. This view, however, did not prevent every precaution being taken and every effort made to keep advised of all movements of the enemy. Johnston's cavalry, meanwhile, had been well out towards our front, and occasional encounters occurred between it and our outposts. On the 1st of April this cavalry became bold and approached our lines, showing that an advance of some kind was contemplated. On the 2d Johnston left Corinth in force to attack my army. On the 4th his cavalry dashed down and captured a small picket guard of 6 or 7 men stationed some 5 miles out from Pittsburg on the Corinth road. Colonel Buckner sent relief to the guard at once, and soon followed in person with an entire regiment, and General Sherman followed Buckner, taking the remainder of a brigade. The pursuit was kept up for some 3 miles beyond the point where the picket guard had been captured, and after nightfall Sherman returned to camp and reported to me by letter what had occurred. At this time a large body of the enemy was hovering to the west of us along the line of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. My apprehension was much greater for the safety of Crump's Landing than it was for Pittsburg. I had no apprehension that the enemy could really capture either place, but I feared it was possible that he might make a rapid dash upon Crump's and destroy our transports and stores, most of which were kept at that point, and then retreat before Wallace could be reinforced. Lew Wallace's position I regarded as so well chosen that he was not removed. At this time I generally spent the day at Pittsburg and returned to Savannah in the evening. I was intending to remove my headquarters to Pittsburg, but Buell was expected daily and would come in at Savannah. I remained at this point, therefore, a few days longer than I otherwise should have done, in order to meet him on his arrival. The skirmishing in our front, however, had been so continuous from about the 3d of April that I did not leave Pittsburg each night until an hour when I felt there would be no further danger before the morning. On Friday, the 4th, the day of Buckland's advance, I was very much injured by my horse falling with me and on me, while I was trying to get to the front where firing had been heard. The night was one of impenetrable darkness, with rain pouring down in torrents. Nothing was visible to the eye except as revealed by the frequent flashes of lightning. Under these circumstances I had to trust to the horse, without guidance, to keep the road. I had not gone far, however, when I met General W. H. L. Wallace and Colonel, afterwards General, McPherson coming from the direction of the front. They said all was quiet so far as the enemy was concerned. On the way back to the boat my horse's feet slipped from under him and he fell with my leg under his body. The extreme softness of the ground, from the excessive rains of the few preceding days, no doubt saved me from a severe injury and protracted lameness. As it was, my ankle was very much injured, so much so that my boot had to be cut off. For 2 or 3 days after I was unable to walk except with crutches. On the 5th, General Nelson with a division of Buell's army arrived at Savannah, and I ordered him to move up the east bank of the river to be in a position where he could be ferried over to Crump's Landing or Pittsburg as occasion required. I had learned that General Buell himself would be at Savannah the next day, and desired to meet me on his arrival. Affairs at Pittsburg Landing had been such for several days that I did not want to be away during the day. I determined, therefore, to take a very early breakfast and ride out to meet Buell, and thus save time. He had arrived on the evening of the 5th, but had not advised me of the fact, and I was not aware of it until some time after. While I was at breakfast, however, heavy firing was heard in the direction of Pittsburg Landing, and I hastened there, sending a hurried note to Buell informing him of the reason why I could not meet him at Savannah. On the way up the river I directed the dispatch boat to run in close to Crump's Landing so that I could communicate with General Lew Wallace. I found him waiting on a boat, apparently expecting to see me, and I directed him to get his troops in line, ready to execute any orders he might receive. He replied that his troops were already under arms and prepared to move. Up to that time I had felt by no means certain that Crump's Landing might not be the point of attack. On reaching the front, however, about 8 A.M., I found that the attack on Pittsburg was unmistakable, and that nothing more than a small guard to protect our transports and stores was needed at Crump's. Captain Baxter, a quartermaster on my staff, was accordingly directed to go back and order General Wallace to march immediately to Pittsburg by the road nearest the river. Captain Baxter made a memorandum of this order. About 1 P.M., not hearing from Wallace and being much in need of reinforcements, I sent 2 more of my staff, Colonel McPherson and Captain Rowley, to bring him up with his division. They reported finding him marching towards Purdy, Bethel, or some point west from the river, and further from Pittsburg by several miles than when he started. The road from his first position to Pittsburg Landing was direct and near the river. Between the 2 points a bridge had been built across Snake Creek by our troops, at which Wallace's command had assisted, expressly to enable the troops at the 2 places to support each other in case of need. Wallace did not arrive in time to take part in the first day's fight. General Wallace has since claimed that the order delivered to him by Captain Baxter was simply to join the right of the army, and that the road over which he marched would have taken him to the road from Pittsburg to Purdy, where it crosses Owl Creek, on the right of Sherman, but this is not where I had ordered him nor where I wanted him to go. I never could see, and do not now see, why any order was necessary further than to direct him to come to Pittsburg Landing, without specifying by what route. His was one of 3 veteran divisions that had been in battle, and its absence was severely felt. Later in the war General Wallace would not have made the mistake that he committed on the 6th of April, 1862. I presume his idea was that by taking the route he did, he would be able to come around on the flank or rear of the enemy, and thus perform an act of heroism that would redound to the credit of his command as well as to the benefit of his country. Some 2 or 3 miles from Pittsburg Landing was a log meeting house called Shiloh. It stood on the ridge which divides the waters of Snake and Lick creeks, the former emptying into the Tennessee just north of Pittsburg Landing, and the latter south. This point was the key to our position and was held by Sherman. His division was at that time wholly raw, no part of it ever having been in an engagement, but I thought this deficiency was more than made up by the superiority of the commander. McClernand was on Sherman's left with troops that had been engaged at Forts Henry and Donaldson, and were therefore veterans so far as Western troops had become such at that stage of the war. Next to McClernand came Prentiss with a raw division, and on the extreme left Stewart with 1 brigade of Sherman's division. Hurlbut was in rear of Prentiss, massed and in reserve at the time of the onset. The division of General C. F. Smith was on the right, also in reserve. General Smith was still sick in bed at Savannah, but within hearing of our guns. His services would no doubt have been of inestimable value had his health permitted his presence. The command of his division devolved upon Brigadier General W. H. L. Wallace, a most estimable and able officer. A veteran, too, for he had served a year in the Mexican War and had been with his command at Henry and Donaldson. Wallace was mortally wounded in the first day's engagement, and with the change of commanders thus necessarily effected in the heat of battle, the efficiency of his division was much weakened. The position of our troops made a continuous line from Lick Creek on the left to Owl Creek, a branch of Snake Creek on the right, facing nearly south and possibly a little west. The water in all these streams was very high at the time and contributed to protect our flanks. The enemy was compelled, therefore, to attack directly in front. This he did with great vigor, inflicting heavy losses on the National side, but suffering much heavier on his own. The Confederate assaults were made with such a disregard of losses on their own side that our line of tents soon fell into their hands. The ground on which the battle was fought was undulating, heavily timbered with scattered clearings, the woods giving some protection to the troops on both sides. There was also considerable underbrush. A number of attempts were made by the enemy to turn our right flank, where Sherman was posted, but every effort was repulsed with heavy loss. But the front attack was kept up so vigorously that, to prevent the success of these attempts to get on our flanks, the National troops were compelled several times to take positions to the rear nearer Pittsburg Landing. When the firing ceased at night, the National line was all of a mile in rear of the position it had occupied in the morning. In one of the backward moves, on the 6th, the division commanded by General Prentiss did not fall back with the others. This left his flanks exposed and enabled the enemy to capture him with about 2,200 of his officers and men. General Badeau gives 4 o'clock of the 6th as about the time this capture took place. He may be right as to the time, but my recollection is that the hour was later. General Prentiss himself gave the hour as 5:30. I was with him, as I was with each of the division commanders that day, several times, and my recollection is that the last time I was with him was about 4:30, when his division was standing up firmly and the general was as cool as if expecting victory. But no matter whether it was 4 or later, the story that he and his command were surprised and captured in their camps is without any foundation whatever. If it had been true, as currently reported at the time and yet believed by thousands of people, that Prentiss and his division had been captured in their beds, there would not have been an all-day struggle, with the loss of thousands killed and wounded on the Confederate side. With a single exception of a few minutes after the capture of Prentiss, a continuous and unbroken line was maintained all day from Snake Creek or its tributaries on the right to Lick Creek or the Tennessee on the left above Pittsburg. There was no hour during the day when there was not heavy firing and generally hard fighting at some point on the line, but seldom at all points at the same time. It was a case of Southern dash against Northern pluck and endurance. 3 of the 5 divisions engaged on Sunday were entirely raw, and many of the men had only received their arms on the way from their states to the field. Many of them had arrived but a day or 2 before, and were hardly able to load their muskets according to the manual. Their officers were equally ignorant of their duties. Under these circumstances it is not astonishing that many of the regiments broke at the first fire. In 2 cases, as I now remember, colonels led their regiments from the field on first hearing the whistle of the enemy's bullets. In these cases the colonels were constitutional cowards, unfit for any military position, but not so the officers and men led out of danger by them. Better troops never went upon a battlefield than many of these officers and men afterwards proved themselves to be, who fled panic-stricken at the first whistle of bullets and shell at Shiloh. During the whole of Sunday I was continuously engaged in passing from one part of the field to another, giving directions to division commanders. In thus moving along the line, however, I never deemed it important to stay long with Sherman. Although his troops were then under fire for the first time, their commander, by his constant presence with them, inspired a confidence in officers and men that enabled them to render services on that bloody battlefield worthy of the best of veterans. McClernand was next to Sherman, and the hardest fighting was in front of these 2 divisions. McClernand told me on that day, the 6th, that he profited much by having so able a commander supporting him. A casualty to Sherman that would have taken him from the field that day would have been a sad one for the troops engaged at Shiloh. And how near we came to this! On the 6th Sherman was shot twice, once in the hand, once in the shoulder, the ball cutting his coat and making a slight wound, and a third ball passed through his hat. In addition to this, he had several horses shot during the day. The nature of this battle was such that cavalry could not be used in front. I therefore formed ours into line in rear to stop stragglers, of whom there were many. When there would be enough of them to make a show, and after they had recovered from their fright, they would be sent to reinforce some part of the line which needed support, without regard to their companies, regiments, or brigades. On one occasion during the day I rode back as far as the river and met General Buell, who had just arrived. I do not remember the hour, but at that time there probably were as many as 4,000 or 5,000 stragglers lying under cover of the river bluff, panic stricken, most of whom would have been shot where they lay without resistance before they would have taken muskets and marched to the front to protect themselves. This meeting between General Buell and myself was on the dispatch boat used to run between the landing and Savannah. It was brief and related specially to his getting his troops over the river. As we left the boat together, Buell's attention was attracted by the men lying under cover of the river bank. I saw him berating them and trying to shame them into joining their regiments. He even threatened them with shells from the gunboats near by. But it was all to no effect. Most of these men afterward proved themselves as gallant as any of those who saved the battle from which they had deserted. I have no doubt that this sight impressed General Buell with the idea that a line of retreat would be a good thing just then. If he had come in by the front instead of through the stragglers in the rear, he would have thought and felt differently. Could he have come through the Confederate rear, he would have witnessed there a scene similar to that at our own. The distant rear of an army engaged in battle is not the best place from which to judge correctly what is going on in front. Later in the war, while occupying the country between the Tennessee and the Mississippi, I learned that the panic in the Confederate lines had not differed much from that within our own. Some of the country people estimated the stragglers from Johnston's army as high as 20,000. Of course this was an exaggeration. The situation at the close of Sunday was as follows. Along the top of the bluff, just south of the log house which stood at Pittsburg Landing, Colonel J.D. Webster of my staff had arranged 20 or more pieces of artillery facing south or up the river. This line of artillery was on the crest of a hill overlooking a deep ravine opening into the Tennessee. Hurlbut, with his division intact, was on the right of this artillery, extending west and possibly a little north. McClernand came next in the general line, looking more to the west. His division was complete in its organization and ready for any duty. Sherman came next, his right extending to Snake Creek. His command, like the other two, was complete in its organization and ready, like its chief, for any service it might be called upon to render. All three divisions were, as a matter of course, more or less shattered and depleted in numbers from the terrible battle of the day. The division of W. H. L. Wallace, as much from the disorder arising from changes of division and brigade commanders under heavy fire, as from any other cause, had lost its organization and did not occupy a place in the line as a division. Prentice's command was gone as a division, many of its members having been killed, wounded, or captured, but it had rendered valiant services before its final dispersal and had contributed a good share to the defence of Shiloh. The right of my line rested near the bank of Snake Creek, a short distance above the bridge which had been built by the troops for the purpose of connecting Crump's Landing and Pittsburg Landing. Sherman had posted some troops in a log house and outbuildings which overlooked both the bridge over which Wallace was expected and the creek above that point. In this last position Sherman was frequently attacked before night, but held the point until he voluntarily abandoned it to advance in order to make room for Lew Wallace, who came up after dark. There was, as I have said, a deep ravine in front of our left. The Tennessee River was very high and there was water to a considerable depth in the ravine. Here the enemy made a last desperate effort to turn our flank, but was repelled. The gunboats Tyler and Lexington, Gwin and Shirk commanding, with the artillery under Webster, aided the army and effectually checked their further progress. Before any of Buell's troops had reached the west bank of the Tennessee, firing had almost entirely ceased. Anything like an attempt on the part of the enemy to advance had absolutely ceased. There was some artillery firing from an unseen enemy, some of his shells passing beyond us, but I do not remember that there was the whistle of a single musket ball heard. As his troops arrived in the dusk, General Buell marched several of his regiments part way down the face of the hill, where they fired briskly for some minutes, but I do not think a single man engaged in this firing received an injury. The attack had spent its force. General Lew Wallace, with 5,000 effective men, arrived after firing had ceased for the day, and was placed on the right. Thus night came. Wallace came, and the advance of Nelson's division came, but none, unless night, in time to be of material service to the gallant men who saved Shiloh on that first day against large odds. Buell's loss on the 6th of April was 2 men killed and 1 wounded, all members of the 36th Indiana Infantry. The Army of the Tennessee lost on that day at least 7,000 men. The presence of 2 or 3 regiments of Buell's army on the west bank before firing ceased had not the slightest effect in preventing the capture of Pittsburg Landing. So confident was I before firing had ceased on the 6th that the next day would bring victory to our arms if we could only take the initiative, that I visited each division commander in person before any reinforcements had reached the field. I directed them to throw out heavy lines of skirmishers in the morning as soon as they could see, and push them forward until they found the enemy, following with their entire divisions in supporting distance, and to engage the enemy as soon as found. To Sherman I told the story of the assault at Fort Donelson, and said that the same tactics would win at Shiloh. Victory was assured when Wallace arrived, even if there had been no other support. I was glad, however, to see the reinforcements of Buell, and credit them with doing all there was for them to do. During the night of the 6th, the remainder of Nelson's division, Buell's army, crossed the river and were ready to advance in the morning, forming the left wing. 2 other divisions, Crittenden's and McCook's, came up the river from Savannah in the transports and were on the west bank early on the 7th. Buell commanded them in person. My command was thus nearly doubled in numbers and efficiency. During the night rain fell in torrents and our troops were exposed to the storm without shelter. I made my headquarters under a tree a few hundred yards back from the river bank. My ankle was so much swollen from the fall of my horse the Friday night preceding, and the bruise was so painful that I could get no rest. The drenching rain would have precluded the possibility of sleep without this additional cause. Some time after midnight, growing restive under the storm and the continuous pain, I moved back to the log house under the bank. This had been taken as a hospital, and all night wounded men were being brought in, their wounds dressed, a leg or an arm amputated as the case might require, and everything being done to save life or alleviate suffering. The sight was more unendurable than encountering the enemy's fire, and I returned to my tree in the rain. The advance on the morning of the 7th developed the enemy in the camps occupied by our troops before the battle began, more than a mile back from the most advanced position of the Confederates on the day before. It is known now that they had not yet learned of the arrival of Buell's command. Possibly they fell back so far to get the shelter of our tents during the rain, and also to get away from the shells that were dropped upon them by the gunboats every 15 minutes during the night. The position of the Union troops on the morning of the 7th was as follows: General Lew Wallace on the right, Sherman on his left, then McClernand, and then Hurlbut. Nelson of Buell's army was on our extreme left, next to the river. Crittenden was next in line after Nelson and on his right. McCook followed and formed the extreme right of Buell's command. My old command thus formed the right wing, while the troops directly under Buell constituted the left wing of the army. These relative positions were retained during the entire day or until the enemy was driven from the field. In a very short time the battle became general all along the line. This day everything was favorable to the Union side. We had now become the attacking party. The enemy was driven back all day, as we had been the day before, until finally he beat a precipitous retreat. The last point held by him was near the road leading from the landing to Corinth, on the left of Sherman and right of McClernand, about 3 o'clock. Being near that point and seeing that the enemy was giving way everywhere else, I gathered up a couple of regiments or parts of regiments from troops nearby, formed them in line of battle and marched them forward, going in front myself to prevent premature or long range firing. At this point there was a clearing between us and the enemy, favorable for charging, although exposed. I knew the enemy were ready to break and only wanted a little encouragement from us to go quickly and join their friends who had started earlier. After marching to within musket range I stopped and let the troops pass. The command "Charge" was given, and was executed with loud cheers and with a run, when the last of the enemy broke. End of section 24. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com.